This is Mark, the show's producer. Forgive me, my boyish voice has disappeared, and in its place, that of an 80-year-old smoker, due to a recent cold that has circulated around the house. This episode is the third blog talk. These are episodes that you can find exclusive to the website for St. Louis Speaks podcast. They're once a week, and usually complement Umar's own radio podcast. In general, my approach is to seek out historians, storytellers, both professional and amateur. A few weeks ago, I posted a thread on the Facebook group talking about local archives. I asked you, what archives do you enjoy researching at? For my part, I treasure the State Historical Society of Missouri St. Louis. That's at UMSL, near the Mercantile Library. That's where I interned both as an undergrad as well as a graduate student. I continue to feel a pull to that archive. Behind the glass in the office, I found joy and insight working with the State Historical Society, from processing collections like the John Buckner and Julia Davis addenda to beginning work on digitization, first with the St. Louis Argus newspaper project, and later with Open Archive STL, which turned into my website of the same name. This is the first of a new series of podcasts I'm planning where I talk with local archivists about what makes their collections special. Hoping to shed light on some of the area's best-known collections, I hope to also learn why archivists do what they do. And maybe, who knows, by listening to one of these podcasts, you might even find and be inspired to visit a new archive you've never knew existed before. I'm thinking about calling this new bit the St. Louis Seeks series. We're always seeking out new answers about our region, and sometimes those answers we seek are right there in front of us, but we don't know they exist because we've never visited this archive before. In this episode, Stefane Russell of St. Louis Magazine sat down with the former director of the State Historical Society, Zelli Fischetti, at Mokabees near Tower Grove Park. Zelli discusses his favorite collections at the State Historical Society, as well as some of the stories behind how they came to be. Zelli was an important mentor to me as I worked in the archives, and I treasure those experiences. I hope you appreciate this podcast just as much as I do. It's both insightful and fun. Pay close attention near the end of the podcast, around the 55 1-hour mark. That's when we cross the street to Tower Grove Park. Here, Zelli goes into different things, first starting with Thad Snow, who led a sharecropper rebellion in South Missouri, and then moving on to Gaslight Square, an area Zelli has a keen interest in, and I think you will enjoy it just as much as I did.
So just so everyone knows who I am, my name is Stefane Russell. I am the culture editor at St. Louis Magazine, and I'm talking to Zelli Fischetti here at lovely Mokabees Coffee House in South St. Louis. And Zelli, you are formerly, I have a couple of titles for you, but you're going to have to tell me what is the correct one. You're retired now, but you were formerly Associate Director of the Western Historical Manuscript Collection at the University of Missouri St. Louis. Although you've had a couple of titles,
well,
right?
the Western Historical Manuscript Collection got
Thank you. It's all mine.
bought by the State Historical Society of Missouri. So I was actually an associate director of the State Historical Society of Missouri, and I ran the St. Louis office. They have offices all over the state.
Right, but so I wanted to start because Zelli, like, we worked together. Like, I'm sort of like the historic photo whisperer at work. So I would go up to the Mercantile and to like UMSL a lot to do photo research, and that's how we crossed paths. But I don't know your background or your story. It was always very like perfunctory, right? I would come in and say, Zelli, help me find this photo, and you would, or this document. And so I wanted to ask you about how there must be little kids out there who at 6 or 7 say, not, I want to be an astronaut, but I want to be an archivist, right? Were you one of those little kids?
No,
or?
not at that age. I mean, actually, I loved history. Mm-hmm. I've always loved history. When I was in the 7th grade, I took my textbook home and read the whole thing the first weekend. But, I grew up, I mean, the first books I read were biographies of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and things like that. And, of course, that affected my attitude about a lot of things. But I got my undergrad degree. Actually, I had a construction company, and I hurt my back. And so my wife, who has had a bunch of degrees, said, well, why don't you go to college? You're always reading books. So I did. I enrolled at UMSL, and I did very well. I got my undergraduate degree in secondary education, and I couldn't find a job because they always tell you there's lots of jobs in teaching, but not social studies or history. Those people never retire.
Because they love their jobs.
They're usually the football coach or whatever.
Right, well, that's true.
So anyway, I was decided to go to graduate school, and I walked into the history department, and there was a sign on the bulletin board, come to work in the archives. So I went over there, and Ann Morris was the director then, and she hired me. And I knew within 3 days that was going to be my career, because I started out working with this collection. It's the Kroger School of Music. And Mr. Kroger, and I don't remember his first name, but he was the musical director for the World's Fair. And there was all this correspondence between him and other famous musicians from the time and things. And I absolutely loved it. So I knew I was going to do that, and I have to say I was there for 26 years, and I never woke up in the morning and said, I don't want to go to work. I mean, every time you get something new in, it'd be like Christmas. You open up, you never know what you're going to get.
So at what point of the timeline was this? Like, what year is this, and how long were you in the construction business before
Well, I've had a lot of jobs. The longest I ever had any job was 3.5 years before I started doing this, and like I say, I was there 26 years. But I used to gravitate between white collar and blue collar, and I really am a blue collar kind of guy. I just, I mean, even when I was in the archives, I mean, I'd figure out ways that we could do things better and quicker in the blue collar thing, like going to pick up collections and things like that. But I worked in a steel plant. I was the wholesale sales manager for a big head shop, Spectrum and Webster Groves. And I worked for Chrysler for 3.5 years. So I've had a lot of jobs, but once I had graduated, of course, I was ready to be a teacher. But that would have been, I think, I started college in 1985. So probably in 91 I went to work. I went to work January of 1990 in the archives. And that was, it's a very low paying job, but I had made enough money in the construction business, and I still was doing stuff on the weekends, little things. So it didn't matter that I wasn't making a lot of money. And if you want to be an archivist, you're not going to make a lot of money.
No, but you make up for the money with joy and
right. And of course, the university had great benefits, and I mean, I make plenty of money to live on now, and from my pension and Social Security. So, I mean, that's a benefit that a lot of people I know aren't going to have. So, working for the university, I actually suggest that to a lot of people. Get a job at the university. The health care is good. Everything is good. I had a 6 weeks vacation a year. It was a wonderful job.
That's not very American. That's very European. So I wanted to ask you specifically, so I remember us having this conversation a long time ago, but it was very brief. So UMSL, I know, when I started working with historical photographs at the magazine, I would go into archives and I would look at the photographs, and it was like, wow, this is like half of St. Louis is missing. There were no photographs of African American families. That that piece seemed to be just absent in a lot of collections. Whereas at UMSL, when I went up there and started, and when I looked online, I was like, wow, there are pictures of middle-class black families, and I know that your archive in particular really was, proactive in getting that material into the archive, and I wanted to touch on that and just kind of the importance of that.
Well, that was Irene Cortinovas, who was the first director, and she decided to collect what the Missouri Historical Society wasn't collecting. So she did women's history, labor history, environmental history, African American history, and or social organizations. So we always had a big strength in that area. And once you start collecting something, like once the word gets out in the African American community that you're the place that has this stuff, not only are you getting researchers, but people are bringing you more stuff. And how we got stuff was amazing. I mean, once in a while I'd go after something, but basically everybody just knew, and they just wanted us to have the stuff.
Well, you guys have a lot, you're retired, but you're still basically kind of...
Right, and I still say us, so...
Yeah, us, okay. I'm just wanting to use the proper word there. I mean, the oral histories, I was looking through the collection online, and there's some pretty amazing stuff in there. I mean, I always went to you guys for photographs, but just in terms of the oral histories, do you want to touch a little bit on like how important those oral histories are?
Well, they are incredibly important because they're people who were there during the history. And again, Irene Cortinovas gets credit for that because she started doing oral histories with local jazz musicians, and then we did a lot on immigrants, and so that we had all these projects. And the latest one, Blanche Toohill and I started one with women, and I at this point they've done over 100 women.
I saw that,
from all over the different walks of life, and we asked them the same questions. So someday that is going to be an incredible research tool for a lot of people, not just historians, but for people who've studied various things, because we ask the same questions. So, and I can just tell you from listening to them, and I transcribed a lot of them, that there are common things in all of them, no matter what walk of life. Some of these ladies were corporate CEOs, and some were selling stuff in a farmer's market. So you had all different kinds of people, but they all mentioned their fathers. That was in almost every one of them.
Wow.
And so, if you sit down with all of these, and of course they're all most of them are online. The ones that aren't online will be online eventually. I mean, you can just search. You could actually create a database, and if you wanted to dig into what they had in common and what they had different.
Oh, so it's cross-referenced, so you can almost, yeah.
And sometimes, there wasn't a lot of reality in some of the people's perspective. I remember one lady said that, I was having trouble getting money, so I went and talked to my neighbor, Mr. Schnook. And I thought, well, if your neighbor's Mr. Schnook, you're in good shape already. But I have to tell you that I learned so much St. Louis history, and St. Louis is one of the best places in the country for history because we have an amazing history here.
Well, that's what always shocked me when I started digging through some of the finding aids. There would be stuff in there. I mean, it's just so much seems to happen here that things get buried very easily. Does that make sense? Like, there are all these weird facets to even something that gets drug out over and over again, like the World's Fair. There's very odd little corners of that. I mean, it's like almost fractal, the history here. And
we didn't do a lot on the World's Fair. I mean, we have some stuff, but we didn't reject it, we took it, but that was the Missouri Historical Society's area, and so we didn't mess with it for the most part. We never turned anything down, not when I was there anyway. I mean, people wanted to give us bowling trophies and stuff, we wouldn't take those, but almost, because when you have an archive, and that's one of the things that a lot of people don't understand, is that archives grow. I mean, there's no okay, here's your building, this is what you have. As soon as that's full, what are you supposed to do? Stop collecting? I don't think so, but, so fortunately they built a huge record center in Columbia, so we're able to put stuff down there, but I forget how many boxes we had down there, but it was thousands of boxes of records and stuff, and everything, there's almost, in every collection I've ever been involved in, there was always something really neat, even if it was mostly boring. And I had a lot of great experiences doing oral histories. George McHugh was the arts and architecture editor for the Post-Dispatch, and I was doing a Gaslight Square project, and he had written about it, so I went to interview him at his house in Kirkwood. And we do the whole interview, and I look down and my tape recorder is stopped. And
I've been there.
I said, I was so embarrassed. I said, and this is the first oral history that I'd ever done. And I said, Mr. McHugh, could we possibly do this again? My recorder said, he said, no, I recorded it. I'll give you a copy. So believe me, after that, it never happened to me again because I always checked my equipment. But I don't know. It was a wonderful experience for me, and I still enjoyed it. I would recommend it to any young person. It's a low stress career. Usually there are no time limits. However long it takes. One of my favorite collections was the League of Women Voters, and I spent over a year doing that. But it is a very important collection because those women did a lot of stuff on early African American health care and things that have been used in many dissertations and things, and in many cases it's the only record of that, that the city didn't keep a record.
Right.
But these ladies would go out, and when they wrote a report, it was a pretty thorough report. And they did everything. They did rat control, the margarine tax, just all kinds of stuff, and the smoke abatement stuff in the city, and so it's a wonderful collection, and you find out that all this stuff is interconnected. You get another collection, and it's involved in that too. I did several projects. One of them was on Gaslight Square, and I interviewed 25 people and collected. In the process, I collected a lot of things, including a huge photo collection.
Well, Thelma Bloomberg was somebody I wanted to ask you about, because I feel like she is still so under the radar. Like Bill Christman and those guys released the book of her photographs.
Parker,
But she's not someone, I think, whose name is just floating out there.
No, Thelma was an interesting person. She, she knew my brother because my brother was a beatnik poet down on Gaslight Square.
Oh, that's right. I remember you telling me.
And he told me, you need to talk to her because she did all these photographs and stuff. So I got in contact with her, and I went and talked to her. And in the process, she said, well, how would you like my photographs? And I said, sure. She said, I need some money.
Good for her.
Well, we raised money and bought the photographs from her. And they were wonderful photographs. It wasn't just the historical aspect of it. She was a good photographer.
Oh, remarkable photographer, yeah.
We had several of those. Art Whitman was probably the best photographers I've ever been in contact with. So I don't know how many photos we have at the place, but we have a lot of photographs, and a lot of very interesting photographs that, you could do a photograph a day forever and still, they would be interesting. They're just that kind of thing. But Thelma was an interesting lady. I made a deal with her that as long as she was alive, we wouldn't sell any of her photographs. She could sell them, but we would tell people to contact her. And that really she was in a nursing home then, and it really got a little complicated. But once she passed away, her nieces gave us a bunch more photographs. They weren't Gaslight Square, but she loved to take photos of children. And she just wandered around the
yeah.
city and did that. And I
Right.
mean, she really was, there are other people that have done that. But I mean, in St. Louis, she's the only one I know. And she took that many photos.
Right. And she captured, I think, because usually she was shooting in just sort of working class neighborhoods. And I feel like she captured things that maybe, for instance, the Post and the Globe were not going out and capturing because it wasn't news. And, it's like there's always this stuff that, and also I feel like, well, Arthur Whitman, I'm a huge fan of him, and Frank Scheidegger as well. Like, Frank Scheidegger, they all captured, there's like this little visual mini archive of, like, certain neighborhoods in the city or Kirkwood, just the lives of ordinary people that would just otherwise be lost. And I feel like that's what you guys do so well, is there's this value put on just, there was an organization that I saw you guys had a collection on. It was the Housewives Club. That kind of information just, because it tends not to have as much importance put on it. You've got George Washington up here, and then you've got the Housewives. It's just, I wanted you to maybe touch on, just how important it is to capture this information on ordinary people, because you guys do
that was always
my
my concentration. I always felt like, because the Missouri Historical Society was doing Charles Lindbergh and the famous St. Louisans, that we wanted to do the not so famous St. Louisans, but important St. Louisans.
Right.
And there are many out there, especially in the African American community. One of Ann Morris, who was the director before me, did a book called Lift Every Voice and Sing, where Doris Wesley went out and did 100 interviews in the African American community. And then, we still have the whole interviews, which are really great too, but Ann capsulized them into small little snippets in the book. And then we hired Wesley, what was her name? Wiley Price.
He's brilliant.
Right,
Yeah, he's
and he was a good photographer
yeah.
too, right. He went out and did shots of all of them. So it's a wonderful book, and we have a lot of people coming in. The stuff just would roll in. We got the burial books from Greenwood Cemetery.
I saw that, which is huge.
And
it's
then
huge, yeah.
I can't remember his name, but he was the archaeology professor at He went out with his students and went through that cemetery and got every name and where it was and all that, and they did these incredible databases and things where I could look up a name and it'd tell me right where it was. And that was hard because most people just wander around looking for their relative and could never find them a lot of times. So I always had a lot of people coming in and looking at that. And Tim Bauman, that was his name. He was, he was a nice guy. But that's what I mean. We initially got the burial books from the owner of the thing, and then Anne went to look at the cemetery and was just disgusted because there was junk all over the place and everything. So she actually got the county to take it away from Solomon Rooks, was the owner, and they had the National Guard out there cleaning it up and all this stuff. So and now it's more of a monument than it ever was. But that led to many other stories, and we ended up. Anne did a whole book on cemeteries. She went around and found all these cemeteries all over. Some of them are like little family ones in the middle of a subdivision and stuff. So,
oh my gosh! Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
So anyway, that's every time when you're working in that kind of field, you get on track on something and you want to know more, and so you go and you talk to people, and we did a lot of oral histories. It was all. Didn't actually do projects all the time. Like I would hear about some gentleman one guy that was he had been shot down in World War II and in France, and he joined the French resistance and was with them for a long time until he finally escaped into Spain. But there's all this correspondence. I went and taught. We did an oral history with him, and he gave us all this correspondence between him and these French people that he had served in there with. And I mean, that ends up going to I lent it to the French professor at UMSL, and she had her students translating everything, and I mean, they really enjoyed it. It's a wonderful thing. And I could, I could tell stories all day about the different things I've seen in there. And I mean, now I'm working in the mercantile, and it's the same kind of thing. I'm doing letters, and I just found a letter from the General Anderson, who was the commanding general of Fort Sumter, and he wrote this letter a month before the Confederates attacked Fort Sumter. So, now the letter itself is he's writing to some doctor friend of his. It has nothing to do with the war, but it's just, you see something like that, and it brings the whole, it makes that a person instead of just a name.
Right.
And that's, at least to me, so that's why I enjoy what I do so much. And of course, Kay, working with Kay Dry is scary in one sense because the stuff she's collecting.
I wanted you to talk on
all
this.
kinds of stuff that'll kill you, But she does any kind of obviously nuclear power plants. She doesn't like them, and Callaway especially. But I mean, she has files on tons of stuff on Chernobyl and on Fukushima and all of this stuff. But she also does toxic chemicals, human experiments, all kinds of stuff. And so that's what I do all day is I go there and I take a section of usually a subject like Chernobyl, and then I process it, and then it ends up going up to the archive then.
Well, it seems like Kay Dry files, like she and Leo were they were pretty much like internationally prominent in that particular slice of the environmental community. I mean, it seems like that, repository of documents is going to eventually like bring tons of scholars to St. Louis, just because I feel like the kinds of things she's been gathering for decades now, it's just like you can't, it's hugely important, right? I mean... Well,
I've watched, in my 26 years, I've watched different aspects of history become prominent in the PhD students and things, and environmental history is starting to get there. I mean, first of all, if you're a historian, you're looking for something that hasn't been written to death about, so you find a new area like environmental history, and Kay has unbelievable amount of stuff. I have no idea. She has an entire archive still at her house. So, and I go there every Friday, and I go down in the basement and I pick up a box and I basically process it. And then it goes to the archives, and they just put a bunch of new stuff up online. But anything that deals with the environment, she's into. And of course, Leo's papers are there too. And he was at one time the largest landowner in the state of Missouri, and he basically gave it all away. And he was the first person to get involved in scientific harvesting of wood, where you didn't cut the whole thing down, which is what they normally did. He went in and cut out selected trees, so you always still had the trees, but you were getting the wood too. So, and they've given a lot of money to a lot of environmental things, and as well as other places. I'm sure I don't really know that part of it, but I just know Kay is a wonderful person, and I mean,
she's a force of nature.
I have a good time with her every Friday, and
I didn't realize you guys had this ongoing Friday appointment. Yeah, that's really cool. Okay.
Well, I mean, I had had a lot of involvement with her when I was working too. I mean, but then when I retired, I wanted to keep my hand in. You got to do something. So. And I like volunteering because if I decide to travel, I just go.
Like,
I don't have to worry about it. But anyway, I enjoy. Actually, we always have lunch, and it's not just me. There's a bunch of other people that volunteer, so it's it's a little gang. They're all women, of course, so they call Zelli's harem. But I took them to lunch, and they got photographs, and But anyway, I love all of them. They're all great, and one of the women who works there, Wendy Verhoff, was a PhD student at Wash U, and she came in, and I turned her on to Kay, and I connected them, and they're still really good friends. And so, Kay's still so active. She's 85, and she's on the phone all day talking to people, and she's going through her files, pulling out stuff for folks. And, she has politicians stopping by every day, and, stuff, other people, scientists, and it's an interesting place to hang out, actually. But
I bet. I can't imagine.
Well, and the mercantile is great too. I mean, I like that because I started out volunteering at our office, but I know all that stuff. I mean, I wanted to go someplace where I didn't know it all.
Right. And sorry to interrupt. I was just going to ask you maybe just, I'm an archives nerd, so I have a sense of because every archive has sort of a personality to it. Like the State Historical Society, St. Louis, it's like very scrappy and working class and counterculture, and the mercantile is not that.
No.
And I was wondering if you could, if the Western I'm calling it
that's okay.
The old archives, so if that's like the scrappy working class counterculture KDHX archive, how would you characterize the Merc?
Well, the mercantile specializes in railroad and steamboats for the most part. I mean, they have other stuff, but
they have the Globe Morgue, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And the mercantile, of course, its history is a bunch of wealthy businessmen who started a library a long, long time ago. I don't remember the year, but they were the first library west of the Mississippi. And so, it's still that way. I mean, it's still, their supporters are still generally wealthy folks, but they've got a wonderful art collection, so they do. They're always doing exhibits. Right now they have pages from the Gutenberg Bible, but actually they're getting ready to have an exhibit. I gave them a piece of my wife's sculpture, and they're going to put that on exhibit soon, and I'm very happy about that. But they're mostly it's the railroad and the steamboat. They each of those have their own curator. And I work for the steamboat curator, and so the railroad one is people come from all over the country to use this stuff, and I mean we had people come from all over the world. I don't know if you know who Tom Dooley is, but Tom Dooley was a medical missionary kind of guy. He had been involved in when they separated Vietnam. They gave the option for the people could go either way for a certain amount of time, and he was in the Navy, and he was doing medical examinations of all the people who wanted to come from the north down to the south. And I guess because of that, he ended up starting a clinic in Laos, and that he did that for years. He got cancer and died very young, but they tried to make him a saint because he went to St. Louis U. He was a staunch Catholic, but people come from. We had a young girl come from Japan.
Wow!
To study to look at his stuff And I know that she probably thought she spoke English very well, but we couldn't understand a word she was saying. Well, this was a beauty because UMSL has a lot of international students.
Right.
And the guy who was in charge of the students in the library, Lou, I went up and said, do you have anybody who speaks Japanese? He said, oh, yeah. So, and this girl spoke good English, right? So I took her down, and she walks in. This is after us all day trying to figure out and she walked in, and they started speaking in Japanese, and you could just see the relief in this young girl's.
Oh, wow.
And basically what she was trying to tell us was she wanted a cheaper hotel, because when she got here, the cab driver had taken her to the Chase Park Plaza.
Oh, no.
So Lou was really great. He picked her up every morning. He got her a motel out by the airport, and he'd pick her up every morning and bring her in. And she was there for like 3 weeks. And but I mean, people came from all over. We have a Friedrich Ecker's collection, which he was a hero of the Revolution of 1848. So people from Germany, whole plane loads come over to look at his stuff. We eventually digitized it all so they could have it in various libraries in Germany. But that's just. I mean, that's when people find, that's one thing the internet did. Before, when I went to work there was no internet. I mean, we started with a thing called Gopher, where we could put our finding aids up. It was text only, and it was mostly just educational institutions that had it.
Right, and it probably was quite expensive to access. And
I don't know.
For the institutions, right? It was hard for.
I had one of the first scanners in St. Louis, and we started scanning the finding aids and putting them up on that. And I have a friend, Raleigh Munns, who's a reference librarian at UMSL, and he was an incredible friend. I mean, he knew computers backwards and forwards, and I went to the National Archives and the Library of Congress, and they had a photo database they were just developing, and it had like 5 photos in it, but you could search and they'd pull it up, and I thought, I got to have one of those. So I came back to UMSL and I approached the computer people and said, this is what I want, because we already had the database with data, but we didn't have the actual photograph. 3 years we're working on it. So I'm complaining to Raleigh. The next day he has a photo database. Now, we had to work some bugs out, but I mean, it was up and running within a week.
Well, this is something I want to touch on, because it feels like there's this huge revolution going on right now. I mean, because you have like everyone from the Met, like everything's kind of going open source, and it's just this flood of information it's like this huge wave of stuff that's hitting the internet. It's like all digital, and I know you're kind of like in this transitional, like you're working with Kay in person.
Traditionally, archives are like, this is mine.
Exactly,
if you're very careful, I'll let you sneak a peek.
Right, exactly.
And we tried to change that. And I mean, I think that, my boss, Ann Morris, she didn't know anything about computers. And she was very hesitant to let me do any of this stuff. But she eventually saw the light. I mean, after I was so persistent that she decided that, and now, of course, she has a computer. She's very much into it. But when the web came around and we could actually put images up and things, that was just another revolution. And there's no way everything will ever be digitized. I mean, there's so many pieces of paper in the archives. But, thousands and thousands of photographs are up there online that people can do a search and find it. And I did the whole Kay Dry's Mallinckrodt collection, was 87 boxes of stuff. And some attorneys came in and somebody was suing somebody and wanted to digitize this stuff, so I let them on the if they let me have a copy of it, I let them digitize it. So they hired some copier company to come in and copy the whole thing, and it's huge. But I organized it all and made it so you could just click on the file and the documents came up. And I gave a copy of that to Kay. I made a deal with it. I wouldn't give it to anyone, that I'd sell it. So I sold several copies of it to other attorneys. But that's the future. The future is, if you want to go to the archives, you just get on the web and go and you just look at all the documents. Now, most, at least older historians, that's no good. They got to touch it. But for younger people, I mean, that's the way they learn,
Right.
So it's going to be the way things are going to get done in the future. The problem is, you can't do it all, so you have to decide what is the most important things to put up. And we've, of course, decided photographs were the primary thing because, it's a visual art. So I don't remember how many photographs we had, but it was a large amount. I'm sure you've looked at the database.
A good number of them.
We were in the front lines of that. For a little office like St. Louis, which you've seen it's not big. There's not that many people that work
cute.
there.
Yeah.
We did a lot of amazing things. And Nancy McElvaney, who I know you worked with a lot, she was a photographer, and so she.
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
okay.
she.
Sometimes she would say, "Oh, she talked like a photographer." She'd be like, you picked a good one this time." Yeah.
Yeah, she was a photographer, and also had her and her partner had a company called Red Elf where they did custom developing and
I didn't know
things
that.
like that.
Okay.
Yeah, that's how I met her too. Was that through my brother, who was a photographer, and she did a lot of his developing and Cibachromes. I don't really know that much about photography. My brother tried to make me a photographer, and he bought me a camera, and I'd carry around with me and never think of anything to shoot. And then I'd not have the camera, and I'd be going, "Oh, I could shoot that if I had the camera." So anyway, it's just, I don't know. The stories are forever, but Nancy was, real asset to me. I only got to hire 3 people in the time I was there because there's never any money,
Right.
And not only that, but nobody's leaving.
Right, yeah, everybody's too happy.
I had one woman whose husband moved back to Virginia, so
she was like,
had to
"All right,
go.
I'll see you later."
So, yeah, she had to retire, so that left an open spot, and they didn't let me fill it. But Nancy had been working in the Museum Studies program, and my first criteria for hiring someone is, do you love history? Because if you don't love history, it's really a file clerk job. If you do love history, it's just like I said, it's one adventure after another. But her and Susan Beatty, who was the other person the one that left for Virginia, but I hired both of them when I had the opportunity. They were both worked together in the Museum Studies program, and they'd come over, and you could just see how excited they were about the documents they were finding and things, and that was I could have taken someone who was a high school dropout. If they liked history, they could do the job.
Right.
If you can count from 1 to 10 and know your ABCs, it pretty much covers it. But it's the interpretation of what you're finding when you're writing that finding aid or describing photographs and things like that. And everybody can't do it. I mean, it's amazing, but there are some people that I've had come in there to work, and they just don't get it. They put this. If you have this wonderful photograph of the arch, the last piece being put in the arch, and they write arch. That's their description. So anyway, that's just, it is a job for people who love history, and I've always loved history, and I still do, and I suspect that, I don't know, I am history. I'm 71 years old. But, I don't know. I just think it's a great job, and I really enjoyed it. What the future holds for me is more volunteer. I want to volunteer in an animal shelter. I just lost my cat, and
I'm sorry.
yeah, and he was He was a wonderful guy. But, I would love to just volunteer in an animal shelter and take care of the cats and dogs and who knows what else. I mean, being retired is a wonderful situation. It really is.
Well, I'm glad you're still up at UMSL because, you would pull stuff out of the staff. Well, those copies of Neurotica from, Jay Landisman's little magazine. I would never have known you guys had those. And actually, just to find out, I wanted to, anybody can come up to the archives, right?
Right.
And maybe you could talk just as we close out, just why people should pay a visit to the archives and how they can go about it.
Well, if you just come in and if you get online and go and cruise through the different collections, if there's something that interests you, if you're interested in Gaslight Square or beatniks or African American healthcare or whatever you're interested in, there's stuff there. And so if you just come, and a lot of people do that. Sometimes we'll have one person come in and do research for their PhD or whatever, and they've got their friend with them, and so they're sitting around and I'll say, what are you interested in?
Yeah, right.
We've got other stuff.
Right.
So, and they end up looking at something else, and then, you see them interacting with each other. Look at this. And, I mean, that's the way we were in the office. Everybody would, find something, they'd run and show it to everyone else. But that's the thing is, it's expanding because of the Internet. Before the Internet, there was a thing called Nukmuk, which was a book.
Is this? It
was called Nukmuk. I can forget what Nukmuk stands for, but it's a catalog, and you filled out a form and you sent it in, and then your collection got put in there. But it was a very small operation. I mean, we only had 3 or 4 collections in there, the major ones, Tom Dooley and that kind of thing. But now, with the Internet, if you get somebody gives you 5 baseball cards, you can put it up there. Nobody's done that yet, but whatever you get. Now we didn't take 3-dimensional stuff for the most part.
Well, that's hard to store, right?
Well, right.
And some archives do take objects.
Oh yeah,
right?
the Mercantile has got tons
I know
of that stuff.
WashU has all kinds of. They have James Merrill's death mask, which I didn't touch, but
they
I
had
did see.
Napoleon's death mask at the Mercantile.
Oh, really?
I used
didn't know that.
They would always bring the students down, and when they're introducing them to the university, and they said, "And here's Napoleon's death mask," and I always said, "Hey, we have Chuck Berry's underwear," but.
That's much more impressive, actually.
Well, for students it would be. But, and we do have some Chuck Berry stuff.
I saw that.
His trial transcripts and some other stuff. And Ken Thomas, who's worked there actually longer than I have.
Who I profiled at one point, right?
And he's a conspiracy theorist and a UFO guy and all that stuff. But he's also a beatnik person.
He's
he
an
loves the
interesting
beatniks.
guy,
And so he did, he collected stuff on William Burroughs and lots of other people, and that stuff's all in the collection.
And Laura X, he was processing Laura X's boxes or all of you guys were at the time.
Laura X is another story altogether.
Right, exactly.
But let's go back to Jay Landisman. I was doing the Gaslight Square thing, and I flew to London, and I spent 10 days talking to him.
Oops.
And, he'd taken me out to introducing me to all these literary people and stuff like that. I really had a great time. Well, as I'm leaving, I don't know how many hours of tape did, but a lot. As I'm leaving, he says, "Would you like my papers?" And I said, "You bet." And he said, "Okay, well, let me get them organized, and I'll let you know." So I got to go back to London for another 10 days and pack up all his stuff and bring it back to St. Louis. And it's amazing. I mean, he was the driving force on Gaslight Square. He was very, he's the one that brought Woody Allen and Barbra Streisand and all those people to St. Louis. And without his place, I don't know what Gaslight Square would have been, but everything fed off of his place. And that's what everybody wanted to go to. They wanted to go down and see
it had that
the shows,
and that
right?
Charisma, right?
At his place. But anyway, he was involved in a lot of other things in St. Louis. He was I don't want to say he was a mover and shaker, but he was interested in a lot of things. Like when they built Euclid's Landing, he had done this elaborate plan for Euclid's Landing.
Oh, I didn't know this.
Yeah,
okay.
And it's in the collection. So, but that's another thing. We have lots of stuff for stuff that never happened. What they were going to do.
Which can sometimes be just as interesting.
Yeah, well, I mean, it is. You could do a whole book on the things that never happened, but we've
like
got
St.
drawings
Louis,
and all kinds of. Here's a story that I really can't verify that it's absolutely true, but it's been written about. Apparently, Walt Disney wanted to put a theme park on the river.
That is true. The Loop just went to auction a month ago. Yeah.
Well, anyway, he came to St. Louis and they had a dinner, and Augie Bush asked him if he was going to sell beer, and he said, "No, I don't sell beer in any of my things." And Augie Bush called him an idiot, and he packed up his people and he left, and that's when they built the place in Orlando. So I read about that. But there are plenty of little things you discover. When you were talking about the World's Fair, well, we had these guys come in who railroad people. And they found this stuff about this little railroad line that was built especially for the World's Fair. They had actually had a name and everything, but it was only ran for a couple of miles at the most.
So where would this have been?
It was right into the park. I mean...
Okay.
And it's not there anymore.
Right.
They tore it up, but it was they were concentrating on that little thing. The president of the Brewers Union was a collector of beer stuff, so we got all these beer labels, and people are coming in from all over the place. And I did a slideshow that. I put a monitor facing out of the window in the front of the place, and I did a slideshow of beer labels, and it was the most impressive thing we ever did for the students. These guys, there'd be 4 or 5 guys out there. Oh, I drank that one. I drank. But I mean, most of the stuff was pre-prohibition stuff. Most of those breweries were gone, but it also he collected all this history, and it was probably the best union. We had a lot of labor collections, and that was probably the best union collection because it was unsanitized. Usually they take out the stuff that makes them look bad. Well, they didn't do that. He didn't do that with us.
What? They just too much stuff. It was hidden.
Well, give you an example. I mean, they have a. This is in World War I, because most of them were Germans. They banned them from going certain places, and so there's all this correspondence with the president of the union, asking them to intercede for them because they need their jobs. Well, also these guys are shooting each other, and I mean it's all in there. And when the Teamsters tried to take it over, there's a real battle going on. And that's all in there, which normally most of the union stuff we have, they would have taken that.
Due to the coughing guy, we decided to move across the street to Tower Grove Park.
Tell the story if you want. There was the government during the Depression wanted to give relief to these sharecroppers who were not making enough money, and so they had this program where they were going to give the plantation owners an amount of dollars, some for them, but some for their workers. And what they did was they just kicked all the workers out so they could keep their money. And so then there was a big demonstration on the highway down in southeast Missouri, and Art Whitman went down there and shot all these great photographs. And Thad Snow was a plantation owner who actually fought for the sharecroppers. And they eventually built a town for the sharecroppers. We called it Cropperville, but it actually had a real name, and I don't remember what that was. But and I mean, that's been written about. There was a video, couple of women from Webster University put together called "Oh Freedom After a While," and it was all about. I can't remember the name of the preacher, but he was a major. I'm going to have to stop because I'm running out of breath.
Okay,
oh, no.
Get to a bench.
A bench, yeah. So Thad Snow. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, Thad Snow wrote a couple of books, and he had a lot of photographs of sharecroppers and things. We had a reunion of the children of the sharecroppers.
So when was this?
And when the ladies from Webster came out with the film, I was a technical advisor because we had the photograph. Mm-hmm. But they had a reunion. It was wonderful. I mean, all these people talked about growing up under those conditions, and it was very neat. I want to say his name was. Oh boy, that's one of the bad things about being older. I have all the data, I just can't access it.
Okay, it looks like they're set up for a wedding, but I don't think they'll mind if we sit on the stairs, maybe, or on the side.
The wedding's taking place right now.
And if they come and kick us out, they come and kick us out.
That fountain right there.
Who knows? They may have good food at the wedding.
Huh?
Oh, this is where we had Leo Dry's memorial.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay, this looks like a okay place to stop. Or, well, we can sit. Here we go. There. Is that too weird?
That's fine.
Okay. Okay.
Let's start with the Gaslight Square story.
Yeah, like go sequentially.
I had a independent study class in graduate school, and I was working at the archives, but we had nothing on Gaslight Square. And I knew from Joe and several of his friends, I'd heard all these stories, and I'd actually been to Gaslight Square. And when I was a kid, because I used to go in, I grew up in Ellisville, which was farms and that kind of woods and back then. But I go in every summer for a couple of weeks with my brother who lives on Del Mar in the city, right? Mm-hmm. And he would take me down to Gaslight Square when he was reading his poetry. And I had nothing to do. I couldn't go in most of the places.
Wait, so you would wait outside the...
Well, there was a coffee house I could go into. Mm-hmm. And there were a few places I could go in. But because I was his brother, everybody, all these beautiful women are all over me. I was having a good time. But so then when I was looking for the independent study thing, I decided to do Gaslight Square. And that's what started me gathering all this information. I went and interviewed Jack Parker, Jack Parker was probably the longest resident of Gaslight Square. Mm-hmm. He had a great story, but he had all this stuff he had collected, and he let me copy it. So now I'm starting to put together a collection, and Joe turned me on to Thelma, and I ended up with a large photo collection. But after a while, people were sending me stuff from all over the country, about Gaslight Square.
Because it affected a lot of people, and a lot of those people left.
Right. And it was a wonderful story. There's a ton of great stories about Gaslight Square. I'll tell you one that's really neat. they when they started O'Connell's, which is still, Jack Parker still has it somewhere around here. But,
yeah, it's up by the garden.
yeah. But anyway, it was on Gaslight Square, and the owners, there were like 3 owners, and one of them was, well, here we go with names again. Anyway, he was an antique dealer who had a wonderful collection of old weapons, from the Middle Ages and stuff. So they're decorating the place with all this. And his wife, Scotty, comes in and says, "Do you really want all these weapons around?" So they took them all down, and that's when it became O'Connell's. And the name O'Connell's was one of the guy's maid's name. And that's how they decided to call it O'Connell's. But, there's another great one about the Pastrami Wars.
I don't know this story. Do you want to tell the Pastrami War story?
This gentleman, Jack Carl, had a little place that between Jimmy Masucci's 2 places.
And this was 2 cents plain? Or
yeah,
okay.
It wasn't too. I mean, this was a little place where he sold deli stuff. Mm-hmm. Well, when Jimmy Masucci sold the place to these other 2 guys, one of them was Fran Landesman's brother, and the other one was a guy named Herb Glazer. They were both wealthy kids, right? Mm-hmm. Well, they want him out of there, so they start selling pastrami sandwiches cheaper than he's selling them. So he lowers his price, and this goes on for a while till they're giving them away free. And he finally did move, and he ended up with a much bigger place. So he came out of it okay. Mm-hmm. But it was just that's what was happening on Gaslight Square, is that these money people came in because it was so successful. I mean, to be down there on a Saturday night, you could not, it's like more people than was at the ball game. I mean, it was just amazing. And it's a little 2-block area. And they're just up and down the street. Every place is jammed. It was really quite an event. And it was nationally known, internationally known.
Right.
But, and there were stories about little old ladies who had antique shops who just got pushed out because it had been called Bedbug Row. That's what Jay Landsman called it. It had been antique places.
Well, and Thelma took pictures of, like she was sort of the chronicler of like the transition, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And so, there were still a lot of antique shops there in the early days, but slowly they got pushed out because people come in, and many of them were just renting, and the people would go to the landlord and say, "We'll pay this much," and the landlord would say, "Get out."
Right.
And so then that's when the go-go places and a lot of those places came in. And I have to be honest with you, the go-go place helped destroy Gaslight Square. But when I got out of the Army, that's the first place I went. But anyway, that was the reasons Gaslight Square failed are many, and there's no one that fits the whole thing. The Landesmans moved. They went to London. Even though the Crystal Palace was still operating, that creative force was gone. And the go-go places had a big part of it because it was attracting teenagers who couldn't go inside, but they'd stand outside. They were drunk. They'd start fighting. And, a lot of people wouldn't go down there. And then this was at the time that the whole Black Power thing is going on, and people were really scared of, white people from out in the county didn't want to come in because it was so crowded you couldn't park there. You had to park in the middle of the African American neighborhood.
Right.
And you got these people in furs and pearls coming walking down the street. What did you think was going to happen? But, slowly, anyway, that's how Jack Parker ended up with O'Connell's. They basically gave it to him because it was, it was like one of the last places on Gaslight Square that was operating. And he kept it, he moved it, and he's been incredibly successful where he is. But
he was the last place, right?
He
was the last guy.
I don't know if there might have been an antique shop or something that was after that, but he was the last
original
bar, whatever. It was he told me that during the last days he was there, they had to take all the liquor home with them at night because otherwise somebody would break in and steal it. But and you know, I mean, it was a shame that it went downhill. But there was a guy who had a Greek place, and of course I can't think of the name, but he when Gaslight Square went down, he committed suicide because that was his place, and he had been there before it was Gaslight Square.
Mm-hmm. Well, there were a lot of
Grecian Gardens.
The Grecian Gardens, right? I mean, I think when you have something that meaningful in your life, I mean, it's just like after World War II, a lot of people committed suicide after the armistice. It was a horrible war, but it gave their life shape and meaning. And so,
but I interviewed a lot of people. I mean, I did customers. I interviewed this businessman, and I said, what did you like about Gaslight Square? He said, I could get a drink in one place and take it with me and walk out and go to another place. So, of course, then I asked some of the people that were running the businesses. They said, oh, yeah, every morning we'd get together and
decide
switch.
Whose glass
the people who ran the places were a community, too. They were, they of course, they got together at night after the place closed and had pot parties and stuff. But I interviewed a police officer, and he said, oh, no, there was no drugs on Gaslight Square. And then I'm interviewing these people and said, oh, yeah, we would go up and there'd be so much pot, it was unbelievable. But, and they went to the Rex Cafe every night. It stayed open all night, and they went there for breakfast after the place closed down. And so they were a real community. Well, I also found other communities. I had a friend named Arthur Gross who lived in the Landesman's apartments.
Oh, wow.
And
okay.
There were a bunch of guys there. They were all like siding salesmen. And their lifestyle was they would work until they got a chunk of money, and then they'd quit and take off for a while and just enjoy themselves. And then when they ran out of money, they'd go back and do it some more. Well, chess became a big thing with them, and so they're playing chess all the time, and these are all in the Landesman's apartments. And I knew Arthur for years. He was really a great guy, but he never really had a regular job his whole life.
He was one of the siding salesmen.
Yeah.
Okay.
And he eventually became an antique dealer in that he would buy stuff. Like if he found out that you liked crystal paperweights. If he saw a crystal paperweight, he'd buy it because he went to auctions and everything. And then he'd call you up and say, hey, I got something I want to show you. And you'd buy it from him and he'd make some money. And he lived down in the central West End in a very nice house right at Euclid and McPherson. It's right next to Bissinger's Candy.
Oh, I know right where that is. Yeah.
He was the first house after the commercial part. So. And, he had what I call a salon. We had people, that millionaire businessman I was talking about, I was down there all the time. And I'd leave school and go down there because there were artists and authors and all kinds of people that met there. And, we'd sit around and talk about the world and different things. But he was a Gaslight Square drunk, I would say. But he told me a story. He said one night somebody had got these commercial fireworks, big fireworks, and he said they wanted to have a fireworks exhibit, and the police said no way. And Arthur, who's drunk, says, "Hey, I'm a professional pyrotechnician." So they let him do it, and he set his pants on fire. I mean, I'm just. That was hilarious, but there's the stories go on and on and on, and I mean Thelma would tell me stories about, she was in O'Connell's trying to take some photographs, and she got up on this table, and people were grabbing her legs and everything. And, she still got a great photograph, though. It's one of the classics of O'Connell's, and they had a big Halloween party for the
I know that photo collection.
People who worked there,
right? Those are wonderful photographs.
Right, Ralph Monteleone's had
It was the coffee shop guy, right?
Right, and he got that because the guy Sam, Well, he was a businessman, and he bought all these espresso machines in Europe and couldn't sell them over here.
Is that the Laughing Buddha guy that got the espresso machines, maybe?
I don't think so.
Okay.
No, he was a businessman in Clayton. But anyway,
oh, got it. Okay.
He starts him and Ralph Monteleone start the cafes because they can use the machines there. And it was very popular, especially with the local people. And Rosalie Leverett is another one I interviewed. She was the first woman to own a place down there, and she told me all these stories about what she had to go through because the city thought she was fronting for the mob.
Because she was a woman?
Yeah, because she was a woman, and they'd raid her place all the time and stuff like that. But her place was called the Left Bank, and she was very popular with locals, and
it was like music and stuff. It was a music place,
she had
right?
music. She had as they were decorating her place, they were doing the little tiles on making the tabletops. She'd have a guy doing it during the evening while everybody was there, but she'd hang local artist stuff up, and she had apartments up above, and she would do traveling music.
My stomach turned over when you
Are
told
we
us.
on?
Yeah, we're on.
Okay, well, let me tell you about my
Your
first
car,
I bought a 50 Ford, and I was working on that. I put a new engine in it, and headers and transmission and stuff, and then I went out to visit Laura X in Berkeley to discuss taking her papers, and she had this old Dodge sitting in front of her house, and I said, man, I really like your car. So she said, okay, well, this was after we started working together. She said, I put it in my will, and I'm going to give it to you when I die. And I said, fine. I mean, I wasn't that excited about it. It was a neat old car, but it was trash. And I think the city finally told her she has to get rid of it because she called me up and said, I'm giving you the car. Well, she kept it mechanically in good shape because her kids drove it. But the body was she hit every car in Berkeley, I know, at one time or another. So it's taken me 8 years to build this car back, and it's only got 41,000 original miles on it. And it was built here in St. Louis in September of 1966, which is when I came home from Vietnam and got out of the Army. So it's the car I should have had then.
Right.
But it's absolutely beautiful. I mean, it's done. It drives wonderful and stuff. But I don't have a garage at home.
So what are you going to do when the hail comes?
Well, I have a place down on Russell and 13th Street where it's a big garage with all old cars in it.
So it's your emergency garage?
I pay a monthly rent to store my car in there because I went to my first car show. After 8 years of working on this car, I went to my first car show last Friday and had a good time, and didn't go last night because it was, if it's hot, I don't have air conditioning in it yet. I will have, but I don't have it yet. But anyway, that's the story of that. Let me talk about Charles Klotzer. I really don't remember how I got in touch with Charles, if he called or...
And for people who don't know, I hate to think there's
tell
people.
You about Charles.
Okay, just so people know who we're talking about. Yeah,
had a great story. His family lived in Germany during the early days of the Nazis, and his father was in a concentration camp, and the Germans at that point were letting people go, letting Jews leave if they could. And they tried to come to America and was refused. So they ended up in Shanghai, China, and that was under Japanese control at that time. And Charles said, they had a little community, and the Japanese didn't treat them that bad at all. I mean, comparatively.
Right.
Anyway, he asked the Japanese commander why they were taking so many Jews, and he said, well, the Germans are always telling us how you Jews are good with money, and we could use the help.
Oh, no.
But he starts publishing a small newspaper there, and with some friends, and he finally gets to come to America in 48, I believe it was. and he settles in St. Louis. And I always ask him, did you do that because you wanted to be as far away from the coast as you could be, so they didn't deport you or whatever? But anyway, he ends up working for Paul Simon, who later became a senator,
right?
But he had a small newspaper, and Charles began doing that, and that got him into the whole publishing business. And he was very successful with that. Apparently, he did the Focus Midwest, and then he did the Journalism Review. And of course, the Journalism Review is still around, but he's not involved in it much anymore. But he also had a big publishing business that he, do books for other people.
Mm-hmm.
And
we should mention that the Journalism Review was the second one in the country, behind Columbia.
Well, anyway, he's a wonderful guy too. I mean, I did interviews with him, and he just, I'm falling asleep. I was really tired. I'd been up all night. I'm doing the interview with him, and I'm starting to fall asleep. And he said, "Okay, I think Zelli's had enough. We'll do this later." And I really felt embarrassed about that. But when you get older,
you'd been up all night, right?
What?
You told him you'd been up all night.
I told him. I told him that actually before we started doing the interview, because I was already getting really tired.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, I never did the part where he came to America because I was so busy. His father had been in a concentration camp, and he told a story about him getting out, and they had beat him up, and he could hardly walk, and they told him if he limped as he was leaving, they said if he limped, they were going to take him right back in. So he had to walk till he got around the corner from the place, and then Charles had been on a children thing that would take him to England, and his sister.
Oh, the kinder transport?
Right,
yeah.
his sister went there, but he backed off because his father was getting out of the concentration camp. So that's how they ended up in Shanghai. He could have been in London, but yeah, he's good. He's a great storyteller, and he had a wonderful collection of stuff.
So what is just some highlights of what was in that?
Well, he's got all of the authors who wrote for the magazines. He had all the correspondence with them and things like that, and some of that is just incredible stuff. But he had all of the layouts, all of the plans for everything he did, and he also collected stuff on what?
Everything.
Yeah, on a lot of St. Louis stuff, on civil rights and a lot of that stuff. So he had files on all of that. He had files on local people. And so it's really a wonderful resource. I don't think it's been processed, but when it is, what?
No, I'm just going.
When it is, it'll be a wonderful resource, and he's still got more stuff. He just always tells.
So you need another lunch date during the week to meet with.
Well, I haven't had any
Kay.
contact with him, but Kay Dry was just telling me that she saw him at the Journalism Review dinner, an annual dinner, I guess they have.
And those guys have been so fierce. Like, when I got to St. Louis, I would hear Charles on DJ Wilson's show on KDHX, and they were the force that was sort of keeping everyone honest, so to speak, right? I mean, is that an accurate perception?
The Post-Dispatch and the Globe-Democrat, when they had both papers, the Post-Dispatch was the left and the Globe-Democrat was the right. Well, once the Globe-Democrat went out of business, you only had one side of the story. And they could tell you anything, which they still can. They put anything in the paper and people believe it. And that's the problem with the internet. Anything everybody puts up there they think is true. I always have people coming up and say, so-and-so is dead. I look it up and no, they're not dead. But so that's one of the problems with the internet. It's wonderful because if you use it correctly, it can be a great resource. And I use it all the time. I mean, I'm on there almost every day looking up different things. But for instance, if you watch a movie that's historic and you want to know really what really happened, you
Right.
get on the internet and you can find that out, and that's always great. I mean, I was watching this show called Roadies, which was this rock and roll roadies thing.
Right.
And this guy talks about his first band was Leonard Skinner, and he just loved these guys, right? So he tells a story about them going to London to be the warm-up band for the Rolling Stones. And they come out, and the people are all like, yeah, where's the Stones? And they start playing Freebird. I don't know if you're familiar with Freebird.
Well, I've been to karaoke, so I know
Okay.
Freebird. Yeah.
Well, anyway, they start playing Freebird, and he says, yeah, by the end of the thing, the people were up, they were just dancing, everybody was having a great time. So I get on the internet just to research it to see if it's true, if they did warm up, and the video is there of the concert. And I mean, they show the beginning, everybody's sitting around, and they start playing. By the end, they're all up doing
Everyone has their lighter in the air.
Yeah, that was just, I love stuff like that. I mean, to get the actual facts.
The primary source.
Right,
Yeah.
of what it was. And I guess I'll always be that way. I do a lot of research still. I've never written a book, but I could.
You should.
Well,
what would you do a book on
many
if you?
books.
Yeah.
I've started many short stories. I write every day. I get up in the morning and I write. And
You need to give this to the world, Zelli.
well, maybe when I'm gone, my niece will give it to the world. But my cat died. I wrote 2 or 3 pages about him, and my wife was an incredible person, and she passed away in January 2016, and she was just the most gifted, artistic individual. All right. Anyway, I write about her all the time because I miss her a lot, but I mean, she could do anything. She could do body work on cars. She was a sculptor, but she also did ceramics, drawing, painting. She had a master's degree in linguistics.
She was Superwoman, basically.
Oh yeah, she was she was a student her whole life. She was taking classes right before she got sick, and she knew all the art people in St. Louis and stuff. And she has 2.
What was her name, baby?
Jay Gregory.
Okay.
She has the Writer's Corner in the Central West End. She did the Kate Chopin
She
sculpture.
did.
And
I had no idea. Okay.
Right on Lindell, right before Euclid, is an old newsboy that's right behind the library there, and that's hers.
I had no idea. Okay.
And she did lots of, and I have 70 pieces of sculpture in my house, which I've been giving them away slowly.
And the Merc is going to include one of her pieces.
Right, I gave them one of her pieces. And, but writing is just, I don't know if I'm a good writer. I just enjoy writing.
My sense is you are, but not having read it, my sense of just knowing you is, I think you are a good writer.
Well, it's kind of free flow. Whatever I'm thinking, I write. And so every morning I get up and I may write a political commentary, or it's just something that gets me going in the morning. I usually get up at 4:30 or 5 o'clock and have a cup of coffee and write some, and then I have breakfast. And my day usually never starts before 9 if I'm for my volunteer work or anything, so I have a lot of time in the morning to do things. And I wrote about this morning.
Maybe you need a blog or a podcast. I think Zelli would have an awesome...
I think you can contribute to our podcast writings. We have writings on the website that me and Umar write.
I think you should, Zelli.
It's one of those things where, I've started 2 short stories and they're almost done. Every time I go in, I think, I'm going to do something with this. And then I start changing it, and, it's a long-term project. And I think they're both interesting stories, but, I don't know if I'll ever do anything with them.
We're about to get rained on. Is there anything you wanted
we
to...
got enough?
Yeah, I think so.
Well, this was